co-chair with Hazel Jackson of the Junior Members Committee of Lincoln's Inn. This event has been put on for junior members to find out more about the roles that they can take on following the bar course, in particular to boost CVs in pursuit of pupillage. We've got an excellent panel tonight who will share their own routes to pupillage and the roles that they've taken on or took on prior to this by way of introduction and the order that they'll introduce themselves. We've got Rehab, Rochelle and Jack. These panelists will talk about what they're doing now, their background and their role and the application process of the role that they took on, and they'll spend about 5 or 6 minutes doing that. And after they've done so, we'll open up the floor to questions from attendees. So if we could start off with Rehab.
Thank you, Ben. Hi, everyone. So like Ben said, my name's Rehab. By way of my background, I graduated from my undergrad in law in 2015. During that time, I volunteered for a few places, had a part-time job. After that, I worked for a year in my undergrad university in the outreach scholarship department. That consisted of basically helping students pursue higher education from disadvantaged backgrounds. I did that for a year before embarking upon my master's degree in public international law. That was at Leiden University in the Netherlands. During that time, I took part in a number of advocacy competitions, did some mooting, Model UN. After that, I came back to the UK and did a legal internship at the European Human Rights Advocacy Centre. So that was around 2017. That was a 3-month internship. I think you've been given some details about the role or the application process, certainly for the European Human Rights Advocacy Centre. My time there consisted of doing research for litigation into human rights abuses that took place in the Caucasus region. So we did a lot of litigation against Russia, for example, and that was consisted predominantly as well of researching precedent into topics such as discrimination against women, discrimination against homosexuals and the trans community across the Caucasus region. And that, I'd say that took quite a bit of adjusting to former internships. The application process for that was quite intense, I'd say, because you had to essentially, well, you had to have a master's degree to apply in the first place in a relevant area, so human rights or public international law. And then the interview process itself, you were asked to give advice on what relevant human rights abuses were taking place, how you'd argue in favour of either the state or the individual bringing a case. And then obviously you began, that was unpaid, but you had expenses covered during that time. So after I finished that internship, I then I did about 10 months of paralegaling before embarking on the bar course. Did the bar course at BPP London. Applied for pupillage during that year. I was thankfully successful. I was offered pupillage and applied for the role as a judicial assistant, and thankfully got that. That was quite a nice week, I'm not gonna lie. So I accepted my offer of pupillage at Garden Court Chambers. I'll be starting that hopefully in April. I was supposed to start it in October, but 2020 being the wonderful year that it is, has resulted in that being deferred for 6 months. So I was a judicial assistant for the past year to Lady Justice King and Lord Justice Moylan in the Court of Appeal. That as well was quite, so the application procedure was via the government website. I think you've been given the link to that, the details to that are advertised usually every year around April time. I'd say mostly it depends on your CV and cover letter. So you'd need quite a lot of the skills that you'd need for a pupillage application. You'd need to highlight essentially whether you have drafting experience, advocacy experience, an ability to communicate with a broad range of people, transferable skills such as that, and obviously your academics, I'd say, would need to be quite, you'd need to have a good record in terms of grades. And so I did that for a year, and this week, in fact, I started as a paralegal in the infected blood inquiry. So my first week for that. And that is basically a very swift run through. I'm conscious that that probably didn't take 6 minutes. But I am more than happy to answer questions on any of my roles. I think it's quite clear that paralegaling across the board is a vital experience for those applying for pupillage. Internships as well, particularly if you want to go into public law or human rights areas such as that, they are vital. And you know, it's quite difficult to get those, I'd say, without having experience prior to that. Like I mentioned, I did quite a lot of volunteering during my undergrad degree. And just starting from there, I'd say you're able to build experience in every other area. So if you're trusted in one role in paralegal, in volunteering, you can then build up a rapport with your peers in that level and be given a lot more responsibility that you can then use to apply for further positions. I know paralegaling is now quite a competitive field, mostly because so many students want to gain that experience. So I definitely say, you know, start where you can in that respect. So volunteering is always an option, as well as paid employment outside of law. The transferable skills there are invaluable in obtaining further experience that you can then use in internship applications. And then those internship applications, those internship positions, I should say, are then can contribute to other applications, such as the role of judicial assistant, which, like I said, is quite similar in terms of requirements to pupillage applications.
Thanks very much, Rehab. Rochelle. I don't know if we can hear you. Is that just me?
No, I can't either, Rochelle.
Perhaps, Rochelle, do you want to try and test your mic and Jack can go next? Yeah, thank you.
Can I be heard? Okay, that's good. I feel like I should start by saying something to the effect of 7 years ago, because my path to pupillage has not been an easy one. It has not been a straightforward one. It has not been a short one. Ultimately, I'll begin by saying this. It took me 7 years from being called to the bar until my starting pupillage, 5 years to secure the pupillage itself. So if I can sort of cast your mind back to sort of the heady days of 2010, 2011, I graduated from Queen's University Belfast with a law degree, having spent a year studying business at the College of Idaho, a small liberal arts college in the United States. And after that point, I decided to do a master's degree at Queen's University in human rights law. And the reason I bring that up is because it becomes more relevant to some of the experience I picked up later on. Immediately after doing my master's degree, I started the bar professional training course, as it then was. I'm not sure if that's still how it's referred to now, in Manchester Metropolitan University. And that's where the years of pain and heartache began as I sort of tilted at windmills in my chaotic search for pupillage. But ultimately, I graduated from the bar course, got called to the bar in 2013, and I've been doing a range of things before starting pupillage at the Government Legal Department in September just past. So immediately after succeeding in getting through the bar course and being called to the bar, I went back to Northern Ireland and took a role as a paralegal with Herbert Freehills. The reason I had gone back home was because I was also then studying to complete the New York bar, which I subsequently did in 2014 before being called to the bar in New York, sworn in as attorney in 2016. And after I'd completed that exam in 2014, I moved back to England, specifically to London, from Herbert Smith's office in Belfast to its office in London. So I worked there for 6 months, and then I secured a scholarship from the Inn to go and work for 3 months at the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. And I'm sure I'll speak about that in a bit more detail later on, but for the purposes of this panel discussion, to give a very brief overview, I was working there for the UK division, but also did some work for the research division. So I was drafting judgments on deportation and extradition appeals. I witnessed judicial deliberations, observed Grand Chamber hearings, compiled contributions for reports to inform the court's approach in certain matters, heard testimony from a Holocaust survivor, for example, at one of the Council of Europe events, and got to sit in on press conferences and different events that were being hosted by the court. So that lasted 3 months, and then I came back to the UK and secured a place working as an assistant editor with Thomson Reuters Practical Law, which, if we have a lot of students on, you may be familiar with using those resources in your own studies, perhaps more Westlaw, which is a sister subsidiary within the wider umbrella. So I was working there specifically in the dispute resolution and arbitration teams for nearly 3 years, drafting current awareness, drafting practice materials for use by people in practice, answering legal queries from practitioners, and also managing, drafting for, running their blog services for dispute resolution and arbitration. After 3 years, I transferred. I was asked if I would be interested in taking up a role within their Brexit team, because people sort of knew of my the fact that I was a political anorak and I had sort of European experience. So I switched to the Brexit team, was with them whenever we departed the European Union, and was with them right up until I started pupillage in September. So since September, I've been working at the Government Legal Department, specifically for one of its Home Office and immigration teams. So I'm there for 6 months. Then in March, I will be seconded to a set of chambers for a further 6 months, at which point, providing all goes well, I will qualify as a barrister. And then for the purposes of the Government Legal Department, they train barristers and solicitors together. So I will do a further 2 seats of training for government purposes in advisory seats, where I'd be working with government departments on different matters there, whereas the work I'm doing at the moment is litigation. So that's been my long and arduous path to date, and I can speak about the different European opportunities, for example, which have been very useful. If I give you a brief example of working in Strasbourg, and the fact that I then wrote about my experiences there for Lincoln's Inn, and I'll send around a link to the report, for example, later on. The fact that I had that writing experience was useful in terms of securing my position at Practical Law, and actually the work also doubled as a pro bono requirement for my New York bar qualifications. And then obviously having that European background helped me secure the Brexit rule, which I do think was ultimately what finally got me over the line in pupillage. I was obviously applying to government, so it was useful that I'd had experience dealing with one of the key issues of the day directly. And then, yes, pupillage finally followed. I think at the moment that's all I have to say by means of introduction, but obviously I'm looking forward to answering your questions, both from the chair and from all of you as the evening goes on.
Thank you very much, Jack. Rochelle, I know we've got our fingers crossed that your microphone is working. I don't know if you can. It looks like it's still not working at the moment. So perhaps what we could do is, I think you can attempt to see, you may have tried this already, but if you go into preferences, and sometimes I find what happens if the audio section is switched for the microphone to the wrong item, it doesn't come up. No, it doesn't look like I can hear anything from Rochelle, so we'll hope that you might be able to join us a bit later. But in the interim, let's jump to some questions. And do, Rochelle, please. Oh, I don't know if anybody heard anything there. I don't think I did. No. There is a Q&A function on Zoom, as some of the panelists may have seen. Already there are some specific questions that have popped up for Rehab and also Jack. So perhaps we could start with those. And I don't know if we want to begin with the question for Rehab, which is, please could you explain a bit more about what your tasks were as a judicial assistant? What did you do on a day-to-day basis, and what were the highlights?
Yeah, of course. Was supposed to do that, clearly just completely went over that. So my role as a judicial assistant essentially involved assisting the judge that I was allocated to with any task that they require assisting with in a legal capacity. So, for example, a lot of the JAs were asked to draft short summaries of permissions to appeal applications. So we'd receive those, we'd analyse the submissions of the applicant, and we would essentially draft an advice on whether we think it meets the test for permission to appeal. And judges get so many of those a day that it is just helpful for them to have a 1 or 2 page summary of the core legal test and whether it's been met or not. Of course, they then go and read the case as a whole, but that as a cover sheet on top of the bundle was helpful for them. In addition, we do the same for full appeals. We'd draft, could vary between 5 and 40 pages. We'd summarize all of the core legal test, whether we think it's been met, any core bits of evidence that we think the judge must consider, because sometimes we'd have 10 bundles of core evidence, depending on what type of case it was, because you could work across a variety of areas of law, because judges generally are on a rota type system, unless they're specific specialized judges in a particular area. So we could have an immigration case one day, family case the next, tax. You'd then obviously have a lot of research to do in the interim if a judge is unfamiliar with a particular area or not as familiar in a particular area. Sometimes cases might, for example, touch on a rare disease. They'd ask you to go and submit some or do some research on that and summarize it in a page. And of course, sometimes judges would have events to go to and speeches to give that they'd ask their JA to help them write a speech for, help them write a presentation if they're doing a presentation somewhere on a legal topic, anything like that. So it is another element of drafting, research, written advocacy, as with a lot of these positions require. Hope that's covered it.
That was great answer, thank you. The one for Jack then. I'm just taking these as they pop up from various places. This is from an anonymous attendee who says, "Hi Jack, what made you take the New York bar? I'm interested in taking it as I currently work for a US law firm in London. Do you think it helps you obtain pupillage alongside the UK bar, of course? Thank you."
No, thanks for your question, anonymous attendee. I will unpack that a little bit. So, in terms of me, the New York bar, it was a very personal decision. I have quite an affinity for the United States for sort of personal family reasons, and I had, as I said, taken an opportunity to study on a different scholarship program with university whenever I was an undergrad, and I was therefore aware of this program that operated at the time in Ireland, and obviously I know it operates in England as well. So I had heard about it, and it was always in the back of my mind. The easy way to answer the question would be I didn't have pupillage, and I was looking around for other things to do. But had I secured pupillage before I did, I'm sure I would have come back to it at some point. So I very much was thinking about the fact that I ultimately am interested in international work, and that it would be useful to have the qualification to enable me to practice over there in the future, if that is indeed what I decided to do, or if it could then enhance my applications for the purposes of pupillage here. And then turning to that, do I think it helped me get pupillage? I think ultimately it was a talking point, but the way I always framed my answer was the fact that I was primarily securing that qualification to help me secure pupillage here, even if it meant that I wasn't necessarily going to be making use of that qualification on a regular basis. It was still something that was quite different, but it was also something that was quite practical and gave me options. And then perhaps if I were able to establish a profile later on in international work, would also give me options in that sense. However, you do have to be careful when answering the question, because obviously chambers, or like me, if you're at the employed bar, people who are recruiting you very much want to know that they're not wasting time and resources in training you. And sometimes you may elicit a response, it's a bit like a red flag. Oh, does this person actually intend to stay here, or are they going to get trained and then leave and we've nothing to show for it? And that's not the case where I was concerned. It was very much something I wanted to do to enhance my position overall. But I think you do have to think about how you frame that and how you would use it here, bearing in mind that it may be something that you have and it's nice to have, but it's not something you're going to be using very regularly. So I wouldn't say that it was something that helped me clinch getting pupillage, because at the end of the day, I was sworn in 2016. I'd passed the exam in 2014, and it's only this year that I've started pupillage. But I think that sort of taken cumulatively, it was again some sort of experience that I had that other people don't have. And I know, for example, I note from your question that you're working for a US law firm, and I think more US law firms do seem to be opening up in the United Kingdom. And I know I interviewed at a firm, a US law firm, which was offering a pupillage, and a colleague of mine that I worked with at the time didn't secure an interview there. And I'm sure that what made the difference for that specific interview was the fact that I had a qualification which was useful for their purposes. But, by all means, I would, absolutely encourage people to take it, but don't necessarily think that that's going to be your magic sort of open sesame into the world of pupillage.
Thanks, Jack. I've noticed we've got Rochelle back online.
Can you hear me now?
And we can.
Yay!
Brilliant.
Massive apologies about that. I'm using my phone now, so you'll have to excuse me with the poor picture quality, but at least now you can hear me, so that's a start.
That's great.
So,
are you happy to just give an introduction as you are?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. So as I was trying to say, and ineffectively last time, my name is Rochelle Powell. I'm currently a pupil at Temple Garden Chambers, where I do a mixture of public law and also personal injury clinical negligence, and lots of road traffic and fraud relating to motor insurance fraud. Prior to pupillage, I studied history, initially at Nottingham University, and then went on to do the GDL at BPP in Leeds, followed by the BPTC at BPP Leeds as well. I then had years where I was working as a paralegal at the Infected Blood Inquiry. Actually ended up working there for slightly longer than intended due to COVID, tried to go travelling, had to fly back, and ended up back on the inquiry, which was great because it was a really good experience. I've had a number of different jobs as well, from waitressing to netball coaching, so a real range, but I'm going to focus on two paralegal experiences that I had in particular. So the first one was in between studying for the GDL and also the BPTC. I worked for a year at a personal injury solicitors as a paralegal, a firm called Lyons Solicitors. And I was a caseload handler there for their road traffic accident personal injury cases. Had my own caseload of about 200 cases, which we were expected to manage for pretty much the entire pre-litigation stage. So involved a range of things, from conferences with clients, making sure we had all of the appropriate information, to negotiating with other solicitors, whether claimant or defendant, to try and achieve settlement, and then also then dealing with things like directions questionnaire, particulars of claim, issuing, all the way up to trial. So for what I'm doing now, some really pertinent experience. Then paralegaling on the infected blood inquiry, I worked specifically doing disclosure work, so they do a number of different streams, but my role there was working with, in particular, NHS Foundation trusts to try and get as much disclosure in as possible from them that was relevant to the inquiry's terms of reference, and obviously do that from more of a public law standpoint. That's just a brief overview of what I did, but I wanted to talk more about the sort of skills and how I thought that was relevant for Pupillage. I think that's probably the most relevant for you. I mean, the obvious point from my time at Lyons Davidson was that it's directly relevant to what I'm doing at Pupillage now, and I definitely think that helped me get Pupillage where I'm at. I didn't initially think that I would be interested in personal injury work. I wanted to pay off my debts from the GDL, and sort of said I want paralegal experience, as relevant as possible. Completely changed my mind and sort of changed how I saw personal injury work, which then has obviously led to me, securing pupillage in that area. I think it was really valuable to be sort of networking with a variety of different solicitors on a daily basis. You get a real understanding of what it is that they need to do, that they require, which I think, from then a barrister's perspective, I now know how the other side works, and I think that allows us to sort of work more closely together, as well as you're reliant on solicitors to give you instructions. So having a familiarity and sort of a client base essentially that you've worked with before is really useful. From the inquiry's perspective, I thought there were some really sort of valuable networking experiences there as well. The inquiry is chaired by a retired High Court judge, and getting to sort of debate with someone, speak with someone like that on a daily basis, to sort of soundboard your ideas with, and often sometimes say, well, no, we're not going to take that approach, we're going to do it this way instead, and understanding the reasoning behind those decisions I thought was invaluable. From an applications perspective, he then was one of my references as well, and if you can't have sort of a judicial reference, that's really, really useful on pupillage applications. Similarly, our solicitor to the inquiry used to work for the government legal department, and now doing, being at a chambers that does public work. Again, having that kind of experience working with government legal department and sort of learning from under him was invaluable. And in the same way, again, moving forward from a pupillage perspective, after having a good experience there, I left and they kind of said, well, in the future, if we're still going, we'd be looking to instruct you as counsel on the inquiry, so you could be a member of the junior counsel team, which again is invaluable and also helps you, when you're setting up practice and you want to be able to demonstrate to chambers that you're likable and that you can bring in your own work. I think if you can do that, those are things that are all going to make your application stand out. So yeah, those are my main sort of two experiences that I think were invaluable. And the one thing that just underpins all of that, sorry, I'll wrap up now because I'm conscious I don't want to talk at you for too long, but it was just the confidence as well. Having, been in those environments, worked with a variety of different sort of legal professionals, I think it really just, gave me the confidence going forward to say, do you know what, this is a job that I can do I've seen how it works, seen what the setup is like, and it's so important in your interviews. You're feeling nervous to at least come across in a confident way, and I think it helps if you've had familiarity speaking with barristers, solicitors, QCs, judges, whoever it is in your workplace. So yeah, definitely think it undoubtedly helped me secure pupillage.
Thanks very much, Rochelle.
Thank you.
Now, as I said, everybody should hopefully have the Q&A button open. So if you spot a question you want to answer, panelists, just please do interject. To start off though, a general one for everyone, and perhaps we can go through in the same order as the panelists spoke, which is just, if you give one piece of advice for applying to pupillage, what would it be? It's quite a difficult one.
I think this not only applies to applying for pupillage, but just generally, if you don't ask, you don't get. Don't put yourself down before you've given someone else an opportunity to knock you off, basically. That is to say, if you believe you've worked to that point and you've gone on to do the bar course, you're intending to do the bar course, why should you not apply to that chambers? Why should you not believe you have a chance at that chambers? I know I, for example, was like this close to cancelling a lot of my pupillage interviews on the morning of them, because I was like, I don't want to embarrass myself on the day. I don't feel ready, any of those things. I think just essentially believe in yourself, and those who are watching you an interview will also believe in you too.
Do you mind if I said two things, Ben?
I think you can get away with two.
Yes. First thing I would say is, in terms of a general piece of advice, I'm tempted to say pray, but the first thing I would say would be persevere, because not to be immodest, but I am proof that if you stick at something, you will eventually get there if you're cut out for it. And I do genuinely believe that. And the reason I have asked if I could say a second thing is that more generally, my advice to people is always to take every opportunity that comes your way. And I've sort of scanned my eye down some of the questions, and I've been asked, did I go through all of these experiences on purpose, or would I have chosen to get pupillage right away, for example? And of course, the ideal route in your head is, no, it would be lovely to graduate and go straight into pupillage. But at the same time, the fact that that didn't happen presented me with sort of a dilemma of, oh, what do I need to do? And it actually meant that I went out and explored opportunities and did some really interesting things that I may not have been able to do had I got pupillage straight away, and things that, of course, I do not regret doing, because they have shaped my interests, they've shaped what I'm good at, and they've ultimately helped me to succeed in getting pupillage. So I think on your path to pupillage, to borrow the phrase from the evening's title, take every opportunity that you can get, because it can only help you, even if it means that you discover something, actually, I don't like this is not for me, I'd rather pursue a different practice area, for example. Take every opportunity and just don't give up.
I think mine would be know yourself. In that, I mean, know what your sort of skills and your attributes are. Also understand maybe perhaps what your slight weaknesses are, and bear those in mind when you're applying to chambers, and also think, make sure that they're applicable to the chambers that you're applying to. I do think it's, if you get to an interview stage, chambers are looking then for a fit. If you're getting interviews, you're good enough, you have the right experience, the intellectual capability, what they're then looking for is this person a fit? And within that, I think you also need to filter the chambers that you apply to. You could be the best candidate, but if you haven't got the right experience, and so you're not going to be the right fit for them. So I think really have a sit and think about what your skills are, what you potentially have over someone else, what your real X factor quality is, if you will, and really make that shine through your applications. Chambers want to get to know you. They don't want you to be a robot. I know it sounds cliched and you've probably heard it before, but it is true. You're obviously not going to be relaxed going into your interviews, and I say this with caution. You shouldn't be completely just acting as you would with your mates, obviously, but do give them a bit of personality through your applications and in interview. They're going to be working with you for a very long time, potentially, if you get tenancy, and they want to know that you're a normal human being. So yeah, definitely know yourself, know what your skills are, and let that shine through, because I think essentially that was the most important thing for me in securing pupillage, with over some places than others.
Thank you. Has anybody from the panel spotted any questions they wanted to answer? There are quite a few popping up. Jack?
I've spotted one about how did I keep my resolve whilst applying for pupillage, and I meant to say at the beginning that I had calculated that I think that I've applied unsuccessfully well over 100 times, and attended maybe a couple dozen different interviews. And in terms of how do you it does become very difficult. And I think ultimately, as a piece of advice more generally, you do need to have a thick skin in this profession. And I think what does help on a personal level is if you have somebody, I'm very fortunate with my wife, who's very understanding and has been a great support to me throughout the past few years while I've been applying. And it was actually quite sweet, because 2 weeks after we got engaged, I was offered pupillage. So accepting pupillage became the second easiest decision that I had ever made. But I do think if you can rely on good people around you, and ultimately know that, it may be a case that you're simply unlucky, and that only you know that if this is something that you want to do, and lots of people will try and put you off. But ultimately, if you have that sort of inner steel, that yes, you're going to take a lot of knocks. And for a lot of you, this may be the first time in your lives where you're actually not succeeding at something. You've maybe sailed through school at this point, you maybe sailed through university and different extracurricular activities, and this is the first time people are going to say no to you, and people are going to try and put roadblocks in your way. And I very much think if any of you have seen Mad Max Fury Road, it's just like this sort of constant barrage of things coming at you that you have to be prepared for. But ultimately, I think you just, if you really believe that this is something that you're cut out for, and I don't mean to be talking pie in the sky stuff, but if you are going about getting the proper, or getting good opportunities and making the most of those, and developing your experiences, reading around your subject so that you're becoming you're gaining an expertise in those fields, there's no reason why you can't succeed. I had, obviously, US election just passed, and I had I'd read a book about Joe Biden recently, and there was quite a nice quote, and I'm probably not going to get it right, but he said that whenever he was growing up, his mother always coached them, you're no better than anybody else, and nobody else is any better than you. And I think you should remind yourselves of that, because yes, there are lots of very good qualified people, but they're not necessarily any better than you are, and just focus on developing your skill set, and if they are the proper skills for the bar, you will get there in the end.
I saw a direct question for Rehab and Rochelle about the application process for the infected blood inquiry, and what if there was anything specific or certain things that they look out for when you applied. And I suppose that might apply to other inquiries as well. But do you have any points that you thought that they particularly looked out for or would be helpful?
Yeah, definitely. From a perspective of all inquiries, read the terms of reference as a starting point. They are going to look for someone, that understands what their inquiry is about and has a handle on the key issues. So as, real basic, I would say, if you can, they're all online and they're always public documents, have a read through. Again, the nature of inquiries, they are public in nature. If they're, especially for the infected blood inquiry, we've had several rounds of hearings now. They're all on YouTube. We've got, we don't work there anymore. We worked there for too long, still referring to it in that context. they've got a Twitter page, a website that's updated regularly. A lot of the information is public, so I would just read as much as you can and try and get an understanding of what the inquiry is all about. Again, with the infected blood inquiry specifically, they try and put sort of the witnesses and the people that are involved at the heart of what they do. So I think an understanding of that and ability to display sort of empathy in terms of, you know, you're going to be dealing with people who've had some pretty horrendous experiences, who've been, you know, infected with HIV or hepatitis C, or indeed families of those who have lost loved ones, you know, through infected blood. So I think they want to see that, yes, you of course can do the work, but also that you're a human being, that you're able to go to some, you know, for example, a witness's house and take a witness statement and display the appropriate level of sort of professionalism, but also empathy, and be able to take a written statement at the same time. So yeah, I think those would be the key things. I don't know if Rehab has anything to add.
No, that's essentially it. I think terms of reference, the list of issues, having a look at similar, it's basically looking up the inquiry. Like Rochelle said, it is all public, as with every public inquiry, showing that you're interested and you're aware of what's going on. So I know for the infected blood inquiry, for example, there was a documentary on it. If you get an interview for it, which I'm sure if you have the transferable skills, like basically everything we seem to have touched upon has required a level of research, looking things up, a level of drafting, and a general ability to do admin, I think, is just across the board with most legal positions. And like we said, it's all about transferable skills in that respect, even if they're not legal. There will be some things you may have done. You may have worked in retail, dealt with customers on a daily basis, shown an ability to communicate with a vast range of people. All of these things are transferable skills, whether they're legal yet or not. So I think other than that.
Thank you. There's another question, unless anybody else wants to jump in with one that they've spotted, which I think was addressed to Rochelle, but can apply equally to everybody else. So perhaps Rochelle, you could go first, and then Rehab and Jack can go after. And the question was, Rochelle, keen to hear your experiences about applying for personal injury. How focused were you with your applications in this area of law? And for application and interview, did you prepare questions on other areas of law? And equally for Rehab and Jack, for the areas that you went in or ended up specialising in. And I know, Jack, you're being in the government legal department slightly different, but you'll be able to explain that in more detail. Rochelle.
Yeah, in terms of my applications, you know, I think there was a heavy focus on personal injury. It depended on the chambers that I was applying to. Those that did more personal injury, obviously, I sort of pushed that through more. I think, you know, after working at Lyons Davidson, it then led to me taking the decision. I did PI as a sort of optional module, which was really, really helpful. Actually, is still very helpful now, and some of the things that I'm dealing with on the more complex side. But also, I then opted to I did the LLM version of the BPTC, and for my thesis, I did that on an area of fundamental dishonesty, and that came up in almost every interview. So I had mentioned it, but definitely, I think there was a heavy PI focus in there. I also did concentrate on public law through my experience with the infected blood inquiry as well, and then also some employment law. So, for example, for Temple Gardens, where I'm at now, they have a law reform question, which I spoke about the Inquiries Act for that. That obviously is a public law focus, but then I would say for the majority of my application, there was probably more of a personal injury focus, which I think, you know, having that split, which is very similar to what Chambers does, obviously, is one of the reasons I think I was offered Pupillage here. But I would say tailor it to your chambers. Try and find out what work they actually do. Often chambers have, you know, numerous practice areas on their websites. Doesn't necessarily really mean that they have they get that, those instructions in those areas. So as far as possible, find out what they actually do and then tailor your application that way. I also have a interest in employment law, so for some of the employment law sets, I would talk about employment as a practice area more as well. So I think it's just really depending where it is that you want to go and where you're applying to.
Rehab or Jack, you've unmuted. Why don't you go?
Yeah. Yes, so I'm aware, obviously, I'm with the government legal department, but I have had a lot of experience with pupillage applications. I think absolutely, as Rochelle says, you need to tailor your application as best as possible to the place where you're applying. And in the government legal department, because I did see a question about this as well, it is a civil service application as much as it is a pupillage application. So you go through a series of aptitude tests. And I think my key piece of advice for those is don't overthink things, because I did go I was applying for the government legal department for as long as I was applying to private practice as well. And it took me a while to sort of finally work out the trick to getting through those. So I think don't overthink it. Then ultimately you go through to an assessment center day where you do some written exercises. Again, the key there is not to be too academic about things. You need to be practical and think about the fact that you're giving a practical advice or whatever it is. And the way the government works is that, but although I actually think this is a very helpful way of thinking things through more generally, is you are asked questions specifically on particular skills that you have, and therefore that allows you to borrow from your experiences. And they tell you when you're in interviews, like, we want you to answer in the following way: STAR, situation, S, task, T, action, or application, and result, R. So you're outlining, what the underlying issue is, what your task therefore is to sort of meet what you're being asked to do, then how you applied your action to that, and then what was the result of that. So if you actually think in that structured way, that's a very useful skill to be able to have, and it will actually help you sort of in private practice applications as well, because I think structure is key. If you don't mind, Ben, I've spotted another couple of things just specifically related, I think, to applications, and I think it's a question that it gets people's backs up, but I actually think it's one that isn't that is right to ask. And how important is the university where you went in terms of getting pupillage? And I think that a lot of people don't like answering this question, and I have at events in the past spoken about the fact that I'm aware that I sound different. For example, I'm aware that I didn't go to I went to a Russell Group university, and I was fortunate, but I wasn't going to an Oxbridge college, for example. And it's obviously you can succeed, and it's not a prerequisite. But what I would advise you to do whenever you're doing your research is to look at the people who are applying for pupillage, because you will see on their profile, you'll see their backgrounds, and that's obviously you're not ruled out from applying if you didn't go to a particular university, but you may want to, unfortunately, bear that in mind in your calculations as to what approach you want to take, because it may point to the type of personality that people want. Because I think what I have found throughout the application process, and whenever I've interviewed, you genuinely do get a feel for chambers or the institution where you're applying to work whenever you go there. And sometimes you come away thinking, okay, once you get over the initial disappointment of not succeeding, you actually think, you know what, I don't know if I'm a right fit in terms of personality. That's not necessarily to do with where you've gone to university, by the way, and that would be completely unfair of me to say, but sometimes you do just come away and thinking, I think that I would be quite uncomfortable here because I have nothing in common with anybody, or my interests completely diverge. So again, that's not limited to where you've gone to university, but I think it is a fair question to ask. And somebody else has also asked, what am I doing? What are my fellow panelists doing? To sort of make sure that people like us are represented going forward. And the Bar Council has a terrific campaign called I Am the Bar, which I've written for, and I'll send a link round at the end. Which is trying to raise the profile of the fact that there are efforts being made by the bar to become more diverse. And I think, you know, coming along to events like this and speaking to students and other people interested in practice and helping you see there's no bar, there should be no bar to your succeeding at the bar, barring your own sort of lack of experience or whatever is needed to get there. So sorry that went sort of off on a tangent there, but I picked up on a couple of questions, and I do think there are things you want to bear in mind whenever you're applying, but at the same time, you know, don't be put off. Bear in mind your structure and tailor your responses to your questions.
Okay, I'm not gonna lie, I may have forgotten the original question.
Well, the original question was, just a reminder, and thanks Jack for those further 2 questions as well, was about when you're applying for the practice area of the chambers you're going into or are in, how focused you were with your applications in the area of law for the application and interview. Did you prepare for questions in other areas of law?
So with that, I'd say if you know a chambers has particularly asked about one practice area, then you do want to tailor your preparation and your application around this. That goes for not just the practice area, but every single question that relates to chambers ethos. So for example, say you know one chambers predominantly does state work. You want to get behind that thought process. You want, if they say, for example, speak about this case in your interview and they ask your thoughts on it, you know chambers generally, if they're generally more representative of a state, that they will usually be on one side and they'll usually come at this from one angle. And you should bear that in mind when answering questions. That's not to say change the law in the area so that it answers the question how you want it to be answered, but just be aware that what side they'd prefer you to be on when answering questions like that. And so for practice areas, yes, detail why you're into an area, show that you've looked it up, show that you can talk about the cases, the high profile cases, as well as tailoring your answers to every other question. Don't generally try not to waffle, as I probably am right now, which comes back down to prepare. Like, that is how you succeed in advocacy. Don't, turn up to an interview and think, just decided this morning that I want to do PI, but I'm sure I can blag it. Probably not going to go down well when you've got 500 other applicants who also really want it and have done their homework. So for every single question that you have on a pupillage application form, you want to prepare for, you want to be concise, you want to draft it as though they are legal submissions. And that will be following the STAR method most of the time. You want to say what your point is briefly, you want to say where your evidence for that is, and then conclude with why you've said it, basically. Make it easy for the person marking your application form. They don't want to hear your long tale of who you are and why you're there. And, well, they might. They want it to be personable, but they don't want to spend their entire week doing that for 500 people. Yeah, and that was my waffly way of saying don't waffle, basically.
That was great, thank you very much. Are there any other questions that are jumping out at anybody before we begin to wrap up? Because I did say we wouldn't finish much after 7 o'clock.
I've spotted one, Ben, just about getting experience in the era of COVID. So I have had a few people have asked me this in the past, how do I go about now that we're sort of all under, tiered, lockdown and all but name, for example, how do I get experience? And yes, of course, in an ideal situation, you would be able to sort of secure your many pupillages as normal or your vacation schemes. But, I'm undergoing the first seat in my pupillage completely remotely, and it's working very effectively. And I think that there are definitely opportunities out there. I'm aware. I think chambers do offer so many pupilages, and they're done virtually. A colleague of mine in my old place of work, he was interested in the solicitor's profession. He did a VAC scheme over the course of 2 weeks, completely remotely, but the prize at the end of it for the number, there was a training contract, and he secured it afterwards. So what I would say is, look, go for those opportunities. Yes, it's not the same as being there in person, but at the end of the day, it might actually be easier because you don't have to make the effort of sort of getting up, getting the train, going in somewhere. It's maybe in a completely different part of the country. You can do it online. And at the very least as well, I think what is quite useful is you are actually then getting to witness how the profession is adapting to these very strange times. And the last thing I should add, because I'm very aware that I'm here in my capacity as a European scholar as well, is that I have been advised that the different European internships that are offered and funded by and many of them are going ahead. So the likes of going to Strasbourg and getting those experiences, going to the EFTA court or the ICC. And I think there are, all of those institutions are finding ways to adapt, and places may have been deferred, but they have been going ahead. So I have been encouraged to encourage all of you, really to look at those opportunities. Those are things that can help you stand out. Applications for those are open on the 23rd of January, and then they close on the 20th of February. And I would really urge you, not just because I'm here in that capacity, but I know how much benefit I had and how it led me on to secure not just pupillage, but other opportunities as well. And those are ideas of experiences that are perhaps slightly different to your run-of-the-mill mini pupillage or your run-of-the-mill VAC scheme, where you're getting a completely different perspective, and you'll also build up different relations with people as well. So what I'll do whenever you're wrapping up is I'll put in the chat box a few links to the likes of the international page. I am the bar report. If anyone has any sort of follow-up questions, I'm happy to get in touch on LinkedIn, so I'll send a link around to that as well.
Thanks, Jack. Rehab or Rochelle, did you have any questions you wanted to answer? And if not, I'll begin to wrap up.
I'm conscious of time, so I was just going to say, if anyone, same as before, if anyone wants to get in contact with me, I'm happy to answer questions that I haven't had an opportunity to in this session, either through LinkedIn or I can provide email addresses, things like that.
I think in terms of online opportunities as well, I'd stress that a lot of courts, well, not a lot of courts, I know the Court of Appeal, for example, streams hearings, or has certainly been doing so during the COVID period, as half of my JA role was spent from home on a laptop and emailing research notes in, for example, and attending hearings virtually. So you may want to look into gaining experience of a courtroom by doing that, checking on the Court of Appeal website or the RCJ website, seeing what hearings are available online. Again, that applies as well to magistrates' courts, maybe. I don't know if the public gallery is open, but you may want to look into that. Any experience you can gain of a courtroom is important, I think, for your applications, just so not just for your applications, but just for your own sense of awareness of the actual role of an advocate. Because if you can talk about what makes good advocacy, you can hopefully emulate it yourself. And I'd stress as well, in terms of taking every opportunity possible, I think in my final year of undergrad, we were offered a trip to The Hague to visit the ICC, for example, the ICTY as well. And whilst I was there, we were given a talk by a defense advocate for international war criminal. And he was essentially speaking in this talk about how they're lacking interns who can help them because they're less funded, obviously, than the prosecution. And then I came home from that and I was like, why not? So I just sent him an email. I was like, I hear you're lacking interns. If you need anyone. And I didn't expect that to give anything back. It was just a cheeky little email on the side. And he came back and was like, yes, I'd really, that'd be great. And I think it was that internship that essentially resulted in most of the experience that followed. My biggest role in my undergrad career was probably assisting on the defense of an international war criminal. And then after that, people seemed to trust me a bit more with work, surprisingly. So again, just ask for opportunities, just as you ask any one of us a question. Reach out to members of chambers for opportunities for work experience. Obviously be respectful. They would be doing you a favor. But yeah, if you don't ask, you don't get.
Thank you. That's great, Nate, to end on. We've had a lot of questions this evening. I see from the Q&A box that we've had about 40. We've only managed to answer, by that count, 9 of them. But we've had some really excellent ones. So this video itself will be going up on the INS YouTube channel, so you will be able to review it if you would say like. And all that is left from me is to really say thanks very much to our really excellent panel tonight. All 3 of them have been brilliant in both their answers and in sharing their experience and time. And I'm sure if we could hear you, you'd be applauding, but we can't. So thank you very much, panelists, and thank you to everybody who's attended this for all of your great questions as well. And the best of luck to those of you who are applying for those roles. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben, Hazel, Clara, and Emma.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.